Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My apologies for being late and keeping you waiting. I actually must begin by saying I owe Ong Wei Chong a great debt of gratitude. He was the one who introduced me to all these documents when they were released for perusal. And he was the one who went through it all and picked all the things that were worth talking about and introducing me to a subject that I only vaguely understood. After all, the subject was supposed to be secret. All these things were all hidden away and nobody's supposed to know about it anyway. So I can't say that I'm the only one who was new to it all. But as a historian, of course, I was immediately very interested to know about new documents. As you know, historians are always interested to hear about new documents and give us a new perspective and new ways of understanding a subject. Of course, at the same time, I'm also aware that all documents are all partial. They never tell the full story. And so it's very difficult to really know the full story simply by looking at the documents. You do need a good background. You need to understand the whole story behind certain events and the way people behaved, the way they acted, vary tremendously from one time to another, one place to another. So this brings me to the main subject which I think is relevant to the book, and that is for all events, when we want to understand a set of new documents, we always have to try and understand the timing of the time of the documents, the place what took place, and the agency, the people involved. These are always the three key things that, as a historian, I'm always curious about. So in this particular case, I really was surprised when Ong Wei Chong came to me the second time with a new set of documents that I knew nothing about, the Voice of the Malayan Democracy. The first time we had done was Voice of the Malayan Revolution, and that was interesting enough, and I learned a great deal from that. But to find that there was another set which came afterwards, which I had not actually heard about, from 1981 to 89, I was genuinely surprised. But again, once I feel very grateful to Wei Chong for introducing me to these new documents, and I was naturally curious to know why these documents are the way they are. Why a different word? This is what caught my eye, of course, immediately, and Wei Chong confirmed that this was a major difference. One was called revolution, the other was called democracy. So why change the word? So obviously that itself makes one curious. Obviously there's a question of timing, a question of place, and a question of agency, all involved in this, that you choose a new word. So why did they not use revolution? And so I look back on the Voice of the Malayan Revolution that I started with Wei Chong's help, to realize that at that point, from 1961 to 80 or thereabouts, when Deng Xiaoping came to Singapore and so on, the word revolution was very much in the air. Everybody talks about it. Everybody used it all the time. And there was great hopes for revolution because there had been, among other things, the victory of the revolutionaries in Vietnam against Americans. That was a big event. The People's Cultural Revolution of Mao Zedong, big event, using words like revolution. And that Cultural Revolution itself had reignited the interest in internationalist revolution, which had been actually diminishing in importance for a while following the collapse of the Indonesian Communist Party in 1965, when Sukarno fell, and Suharto basically, and his group, completely destroyed the PKI. Something, again, that surprised us at the time, how thoroughly the PKI had been eliminated from the scene, when we had heard that the PKI was, at that point, one of the largest communist parties in the world, and yet it just disappeared, destroyed. So that was in 1965. And yet, there we were, right through all that, the voice of the Malayan Revolution continued, still believing in the revolution. Why did he go on? Well, he went on because, as I said, the revolution did well against the Americans, at least so it appeared, and defeated the Americans. And then the Mao Zedong's Cultural Revolution continued for another decade or so until Mao Zedong died. Of course, looking back, we know that that revolution of Mao Zedong turned out to be a disaster for the Chinese economy. We know that. But politically, it still had some impact on a lot of idealistic people around the world who believed in international revolution. But essentially what happened, after Mao Zedong died, within a few years, Deng Xiaoping had appeared to offer a completely different way of dealing with the economic recovery or economic development of China, which he thought was utterly essential. There's no point being victorious, ideologically victorious in one way or the other, without being economically capable of surviving. And the Chinese economy in 1975 was really in a disastrous condition. So what did Deng Xiaoping offer? One of the first things that I noticed, and most people noticed at the time, was he dropped the word revolution. If you look at Deng Xiaoping's writings after 1980 or so, he never uses the word revolution. He only uses the word reform. And what he meant by that was the revolution had already been done. It was successful. The revolution was successful in 1949 when the Chinese Communist Party won. So you don't need any more revolutions. What you need is that to make sure that that revolution has long-term success. And what you need to do is to reform it, to make sure that, and in a revolution is a very messy business, you make a lot of mistakes, then you would correct all those mistakes, and that means reform. So he used the word reform, dropped the word revolution. So I noticed that from Deng Xiaoping's writing, and he came here. The whole of China's policies towards the world changed completely. I was in Australia at the time. We had visitors from China. We had Australia, after the establishment of United Nations recognition of the PRC onwards, diplomatic relations have been established. All kinds of relationships were established, extremely friendly. And almost nobody used the word revolution. Everybody was talking about, new relationships, Australia, China, all over Southeast Asia, one after the other in the 1970s, including Malaysia, including Malaysia, Philippines, which could be very anti-communist before that, established diplomatic relations with China. And nobody talked about revolution. And yet VMR, the revolution continued right up to, 1980. 1980, then the VMT came in. So they went on for a few more years still using the word revolution when almost nobody talked about revolution after that, particularly China. The Chinese don't talk about it anymore. So I thought eventually, I think the message got through. After all, the MCP had been defeated as early as 1960. They had withdrawn to Thailand. They were really out of the direct conflict with any of the official forces of Malaya or Singapore, and they were defending themselves and barely surviving. And frankly, from what I understand, they were fighting among themselves in trying to reinterpret what this new world was like without the word revolution. I don't know what they were talking about because I don't know enough about it. I noticed that our friend C.C. Chin is going to bring out the memoirs of Chen Ping. I'm waiting. I've seen some of the documents, but I haven't seen the full set. And whether Chen Ping's recollection of whether he would explain how exactly the word revolution got replaced by something else. But anyway, that is, to me, extremely interesting. So then when it stopped in 1980, and then when it started again as BMD, Voice of the Malayan Democracy, suddenly you notice, of course, a different time. It was a different place because the place was no longer from Hunan in China, but from Thailand, in southern Thailand. And it was a different set of people who were making those statements of the VMD. And without using the word revolution, but using the word democracy, they were aiming at different people. In other words, different agents were involved in this. They were aiming at different people from a different place at a different time. Now, for a historian, that itself is so fascinating. Why do you, and if you have to change, why do you change to something like democracy, which is a word which was also used by the revolutionaries all the time. They used it, but it was always something, a kind of an instrument of a revolution. But now democracy was a key word. And when I looked at the set of documents that Wei Chong showed me when producing this new book, I was trying to understand what they meant by democracy. And I was very struck by a very simple thing. First of all, it was addressed to the Malays. I mean, a whole bunch of things was all couched in different terms, in terms of a different authority. They weren't fighting anti-colonials anymore because they were not anti-colonial anymore. The British had gone. Now they were dealing with Malay rulers. So they're concentrating on their feudal, bureaucratic, corrupt of regimes and so on. And they were talking about Malay leaders as being the reactionaries. So within just a few years, between 80 and 81, previously they were attacking Chinese who were not loyal to PRC. Now they were suddenly attacking Malays, all within a few months. I mean, exactly who made that decision, why that decision was made, I really would like to understand, but I'm not sure that Chin Peng's memoirs will tell me what the answer is. But this is fascinating that it should occur, and they start again, and if you read the voices there, it's basically addressed to the Malay leaders. Of course, they also were trying to address the Chinese in Singapore and some of the Chinese who are unhappy with the post-1969 riots, new regime in China, in Malaya, especially after it was taken over by Mahathir. Mahathir was very tough on these left-wing Malays. Some of my old friends like Syed Hussein Ali and Qasim Abhan were all now regarded as heroes in the different context. But in the previous period, they would not have been counted as revolutionaries. They were simply dissidents, rather liberal, critical of the regime, but they wouldn't have been really wouldn't have qualified quite as revolutionaries who went in to make sacrifices in the jungle. But now they were the heroes. And they were all reflecting on the Malay Nationalist Party, going right back to something completely, that is previously totally unrelated to the revolution. When you think of the MNP, when it started, that was purely an anti-colonial, anti-British movement, and eventually it produced, not far from being a revolutionary party, it produced the Pan-Islamic Party under Burhanuddin's leadership, and it became really an Islamic opposition to the feudal rulers of the sultanates of the 9 Malay states. So you can see all these complexities. What do the mean by all these words? So let me just, I can go on because it's so fascinating. But if you just go back to these two words, revolution and democracy, and see how they are being used. Again, timing, place, and agency, very important. How you use these words. I mean, they are all very vague words, actually. And most importantly, all those words are foreign to us in Asia. Revolution was a word that was introduced as late as the late 19th century, and it was drawn from the two revolutions that created the Republic of France and the United States. Those were the first two republics that were successful revolutions. After that, of course, there were German attempts at revolution. The French Revolution took many, many times before it really succeeded. And eventually we had the Soviet Revolution, which was the climax of the revolutions. But these are all foreign words, very modern, only less than 150 years old. As for democracy, which is an older word, there's no such word in any Asian language that I know. So again, another foreign word. So we're dealing with a group of people fighting and sacrificing their lives and giving up all their ideals elsewhere and their light elsewhere to go into the jungle and make a commitment to fight for these words like revolution and democracy which are so new to them, but were very foreign to everybody in the country, and they're trying to make sense of it. So how did they actually communicate the idea of revolution in the first phase and the idea of democracy to the second phase, and hope that the people who really understand what they were talking about is something, to my mind, of great interest. I'm very curious to know, but I don't have the answer. I'm hoping that Wei Chong in his next book will do some analysis about what are the consequences of using words like that on people who are innocent of those words. How did they understand it? What did the Malays think of revolution? What did the Malays think of democracy when the second time round, when Abdullah Sidi and all that were projecting these new words to the Malay peasantry and the Malay dissidents on the mainland, and to the Chinese? What did they mean? What did that mean to the Chinese of Singapore in the 1980s and so on? By that time, my understanding was their idea of democracy was being anti-PAP. It was not anti-colonial, it was anti-PAP. And if I understand them correctly, they were mostly very liberal Democrats, complaining about authoritarian rule, lack of democracy, and so on, because they were modeling themselves on liberal capitalism in America. They were using American and Western European criteria to attack the PAP government. And that's what they meant by democracy. Is that what these people meant? The voice of Malayan democracy? I doubt it. But I'm not sure that they even realized it was a difference, and that the audience that they were talking to were people who were quite different when using the word democracy at the time. I think I get told wrong enough. Just to give you a flavor of what this book can bring out if you read it and read between the lines sometime and try to understand how these minds at that particular time, in that particular place, now separate, Singapore and Malaya separately addressing different people, but using the same message, addressing two people. I find it extraordinary that they could believe that those two messages could have the same impact on the audiences who are listening to it. So as you can see, I'm very puzzled, very fascinated, and waiting for Wei Chong to do his next book and analyze it all to us. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Afternoon, everybody, and thanks once again, Prof. Wang, for your excellent overview of the book and, in fact, the entire phenomenon of the VMR, Voice of Malayan Revolution, and culminating in the current project, Ong Wei Chong, my colleague, of Voice of Malayan Democracy. So a lot of history there to be unpacked. And now, let's first invite our panelists to come up to the front, Prof. Wang, Dr. Ong, and Sepua. So, as we prepare for the session involving the presentation of the book proper by Dr. Ong Wei Chong, first, Dr. Ong Wei Chong will present the book Voice of Malayan Democracy, because we had worked on it, and we should hear from him on the key content of the book. He will have 15 minutes. After that, our discussant, also from RSIS, my colleague, Mr. Chong Wan, will give his reaction to the book, and he will also have 15 minutes. And after that, between 3:45 until 4:45, we will have about an hour for discussion, where I will engage with Prof. Wang, Dr. Ong, and Sekua, and of course with all of you. So please feel free to jump in and ask or make any comments as you wish. First of all, can we just say a few things about the author? It's very important. Dr. Ong Wei Chong, I've known Wei Chong for many years. I should I say that you're my student? But maybe I shouldn't. Anyway, Dr. Ong, he has come a long way on his own merits. He completed his doctoral studies with the Center for the Study of War, Faith, and Society at Exeter University in 2010, where he received several research grants from Exeter University and the Royal Historical Society. He's also won other grants from MOE on research project on the Cold War insurgency. He has published extensively in journals such as the RSIS Journal, Armed Forces in Society, Small Wars in Insurgencies, Defense Studies, Pacific Review. It's a long list. what I will say is, you want to think about Ong Wei Chong. He is, I will consider him to be the key historian on what we call the second Malayan emergency, which essentially lasted from about 1969 to about 1989. Let's put it that way. So he is the key guy to talk about all these events involving both the armed revolution of the CPM from 1969 to 89, including the story of the Voice of Malayan Revolution, 69 to 81, and then subsequently this particular new book project of his, Voice of Malayan Democracy. So we look forward to Dr. Ong in sort of share with us the content of this particular book. After them, after 50 minutes, right? For that is the Kwa Chong Wan, who is a very senior colleague, the senior fellow in RSIS. He has also had a lot of experience as a practitioner, who in these days as a practitioner in the 70s and 80s had the hands-on kind of experience dealing with the communists in the real world. So he brings that perspective as well. So that would be a very interesting opportunity to see both of them, as well as Prof. Wan, who has the wide picture, engage with this particular topic. So with that, pass the time to Wei Chong, take us through the book. Thank you.
Thank you, Dean, for the very kind introduction. So I don't want to go into war stories because I can go on forever. In fact, it was Professor Kuang who actually introduced me to this field. I remember when I sort of went to him to sort of work on to sort of ask for suggestions on a master's dissertation topic. He was almost suggested I should work on this as well as work together with Prof. Wang on the VMR volume. So that's how we all got started. And I've not left the topic ever since. So instead of having a couple of guys on the Elder Shoes talk about old war stories, I think what I would do is to really start off my introductory remarks by thanking this young lady here, Zhu Yi, who was actually instrumental in doing a lot of the backroom work on this, especially with regards to the kind of editorial work which unfortunately AI still can't handle. So for those of us who are not too AI savvy, I think we will have jobs in certain areas. But as a historian, I do like to make predictions, and hopefully, I will be proven wrong on the trajectory of AI. But I think that's not really the conversation for today. So I'll just go back to the topic of today, which is on the voice of Malayan democracy. And I would like to sort of put to everyone that if we look at the voice of Malayan democracy, it cannot be separated from the VMR, which I think Prof. Wang sort of alluded to earlier. So let me sort of go a little bit into the background of the BMD, or the Voice of Malayan Democracy, which was essentially the clandestine radio station of the CPM from 81 to 1990. And as Prof. Wang alluded earlier to, the VMD was actually the successor to the CPM's first such station, which was the Voice of Malayan Revolution. And both the VMR and VMD ran with the support of the CCP, but there is a significant difference. So whereas the VMR transmitted from a restricted Chinese military base in Hunan, China, the VMD was somewhat different. So when Deng Xiaoping was eventually persuaded to close the VMR station in China, which was often a sticky issue in Sino-Malaysian and Sino-Singapore relations, they actually set up the VMD, which was based on a mobile transmitter in the CPM's southern Thailand jungle stronghold. So that's a little bit, that should give you a little bit of inkling of the relationship between the CCP as well as the CPM. And whilst the VMR marked the height of revolutionary violence in Southeast Asia in the 60s, as well as the resurgence of the CPM, I would put to you that the VMD encapsulated the winding down of the Cold War in Asia, as well as the demise of the CPM, as Prof. mentioned earlier, as a revolutionary movement. And I would say that the VMD broadcast in this volume provides a glimpse into the CPM's worldview in the latter part of the so-called second emergency, which Dean mentioned earlier, from 69 to 89. And it helps to explain why the party continued in his armed struggle despite dwindling international as well as local support. So I think the significance of the the VMD is really sort of giving us a glimpse of the changing dynamics of the Cold War in Southeast Asia. And it sort of gives us a sense of why the CPM persisted in its armed struggle right to the very end. So it's sort of actually built on what Prof. Wang mentioned earlier about the relationship of the CCP with the CPM. So let me find, yeah. So as Prof. Wang mentioned, under Deng, they were no longer a revolutionary party. So rather than exporting revolution as a means of legitimizing CCP rule, Deng Xiaoping's focus was very much on engaging non-communist ASEAN states as a bloc to counter the Soviet Union as well as Vietnam. And in this, Deng was very clear. On the issue of the CPM, Deng explained to the Malaysian Prime Minister Hun Sen on in 1978 that it would be difficult for China to attract and keep supporters on board if it suddenly were to disown previous allies, which include the CPM. And when Deng met Prime Minister Lee Kuan Yew in Singapore in the same month in 1978, Lee described how ASEAN countries were worried about Chinese broadcasts engaging revolution. And when asked by Deng, what do you and the ASEAN countries want us to do? Lee responded, stop the radio broadcast. And in this case, Lee Kuan Yew had been persuasive, and Deng was very, very hard-pressed on the VMI issue. And if you look at Jinping's memoirs, he actually wrote that he recognized the pointlessness of arguing with Deng on this. And in February 1981, Premier Zhao Zhiyang announced in Bangkok that the CCP support for Southeast Asian Communist parties were only political and moral, and China would make efforts to ensure that party-to-party ties did not affect friendship and cooperation with ASEAN countries. So by then, Deng was actually sufficiently persuaded to shut down the CPM's clandestine radio station in China and did resolve to do so. So I had a very interesting conversation earlier with Prof. Wang about the date in which the VMR was actually closed. So it was actually in 1981. And the reason why was because that sort of hardliners like Hua Guofeng, Mao's designated successor in 1976, was formally removed from all his key posts at the 6th plenum in June 1981. So those dates matter, and therefore it's only in 1981 that Deng provides the go-ahead to sort of shut down the VMR. And I mentioned earlier about how when it came to the VMD, it was a much smaller operation, and so instead of like operating from a Chinese military base, they actually had to get a mobile transmitter with obviously financial assistance from the CCP. And when the VMD hit the airwaves in July 1981, it was clear that it was operated on a much smaller scale than the VMR. So instead of broadcasting in Chinese, English, Malay, and Tamil, like what the VMR did, the VMD only ran Chinese and Malay programs twice a day. And unlike the VMR station, which was safe from attack on Chinese soil, the VMD station in southern Thailand had to be concealed from Thai air reconnaissance and ground security forces. So by virtue of the fact that the VMD had to be concealed in a deep jungle base, it sort of limited the scale of operation. So access to personnel and resources were a lot more limited. And if you sort of look at the transcripts of broadcasts, they were actually received very poorly in Malaysia and Singapore. So I think it is a very clear reflection of the relationship between the CPM and the CCP. And I will now sort of go into the aspect of what the VMD reveals and what it does not reveal, which has been sort of touched earlier by Prof. Wang. So I think one of the key aspects which the VMD does little to review is the decision to end the armed struggle in 1989 when they signed the Hat Yai Peace Accords. But it's clear by the 1980s that the CPM leadership realized that the armed struggle had failed. So why did they persist in the armed struggle? So that's a very, very interesting question to ask, especially if you look at the evidence before you. So if you look at the evidence before you, which I've laid out a little bit, is that external support was reduced to moral support from fraternal communist parties, and the party had struggled to replenish its aging cadre. So if you think about what happened at the end of the emergency, which Kumar is the main guru, is that they actually had a long march from the heartlands of Malaysia, around Cameron Highlands, all the way to southern Thailand. And when they reached southern Thailand, they actually had immense difficulties in actually recruitment to replenish, their aging leadership as well as ranks, as well as rank and files. And so one of the notable features which Prof. Wang mentioned is the propagating of CPM's constitutions, manifestos, declarations, although they sort of tried to use a slightly different language, right? So you notice this, as Prof. Wang mentioned, in the transcript itself. But I would say that the VMD also served as an important sort of oral repository of the CPM documents, because if you look at a lot of documents, a lot of them were actually propagated via the VMD. So it serves as a very useful record of, okay, thank you, David, 5 minutes left, as a showcase of key documents, because I gather from CC Chin that some of the documents were actually lost. Some of them actually fell into the river. They could not retrieve them. So I think this is where the VMD is very, very useful. It served as a repository of key documents that define the direction of the CPS armed struggle and ultimately the road to peace in the last decade of the revolution. So I'm not really going to highlight the themes which Prof. Wang mentioned earlier, but I would say that in addition to the CPM's own armed struggle, the VMD also provides a window to the party's own internal struggle. So, as you know, in any family, there's always like internal dispute, right? So in 1983, the two splittist factions of the CPM Marxist-Leninists, as well as the revolutionary faction, merged to form the Communist Party of Malaysia, not Malaya. And, if you sort of go into the VMD, they often denounce the Communist Party of Malaysia as an anti-party clique. So it gives us a very useful glimpse into the split within the party itself. And I would also argue that why this book actually speaks to me, because it actually allows you to sort of look at the armed struggle of the CPM amidst the changing dynamics of the Cold War. And hopefully this would also resonate with the readers like you on contemporary issues in history that remains relevant. So as Hallbrands, a historian, would tell us, although the Cold War isn't a precise match for today's competitions, it isn't such a bad one either. So I would say the VMD and the CPM's armed struggle actually reminds us that whilst it was a proxy war set against the larger canvas of Cold War long-term competition in Southeast Asia, it was also a protected struggle that afflicted Malaysia, Singapore for half a century, and is basically a template where we can draw useful insights for present long-term protracted struggle. So with that, I would hand over the podium to my colleague, Mr. Clark.
I would like to thank Dr. Ong for inviting me to comment on his new book and start by asking how many of us in this room are aware of and have even tried to tune in to this voice of the Malayan democracy. I suspect not very many have heard of this voice of Malayan democracy, and much less strive to tune into it. So, I think we have to thank Dr. Ong for this new work informing us of this long-forgotten radio station. The question, of course, is how and why is this radio station, forgotten radio station, relevant to us today? Some of us to be aware, and I think both Dr. Wang and Dr. Hong have founded it. Back in 1978, Mr. Lee Kuan Yew had advised Mr. Deng Xiaoping that on his historic first visit to Singapore, if you want to improve relations with Singapore, ASEAN, then go and stop that radio station, shut down that Voice of the Malayan Revolution radio station. And I think Mr. Deng did say, I got to think about that. And he didn't exactly say why he had to think 3 years about it. But now we know that it was a lot of political opposition in China at that point of time. And we could only shut it down 3 years later. But again here, few of us are aware of this Voice of the Malayan Revolution. And I think among even those who got white hair among us, I don't think we can claim to have tried to tune into the Voice of the Malayan Revolution in the 1970s. And of course, we are aware of it because Prof. Wang and Dr. Ong had already produced a book of it. And we had today, I think, an insight into the inner workings, like I said earlier, Voice of the Malayan Revolution from Yu Chuit. He was a key member of the radio station. And our colleague here, Mr. C.C. Chin, has to be credited for publishing and translating Mr. Yu's oral history interview. To deviate here a bit, Yu Chuit was a fellow student of Dr. Goh Keng Swee at Raffles College before World War II. That I have privately heard Dr. Goh comment, Mr. Yu is actually as brilliant as I've had, if not more so. But Dr. Goh, he wasn't destined for a job in the colonial service, except that his path took a different turn from that of Dr. Goh. Yu turned to the Malayan Communist Party after World War II, and he rose to run the party's United Front activities in Singapore from Indonesia right through 1950. I think he decamped Singapore in 1952 when the special branch was onto him. So I think the account goes, he took a sub-ban out to the Rials. And from there he was in Indonesia running the United Front activities here. You may remember that Mr. Lee Kuan Yew mentioned meeting the plinth. Somebody, a representative of the NCP named he made the plinth in the run-up to the 1959 elections. Now, Yu was the boss of the plinth, Ong Chong Tik, as we now know. Yu was but then Yu was forced to decamp and leave Indonesia in 1965 when the coup occurred, as Wee Chong has pointed out, and he lost the support of the Indonesian Communist Party to operate from here, and he went to China. He went off to China, and he arrived there at the point of time, fortunately, when Mao in 1969 was finally convinced ready to support the MCP to set up a radio station. Now, I think it's significant to note of this radio station that the Malayan Voice of the Malayan Revolution was set up following a similar radio station Mao had approved for the Communist Party of Thailand, the Voice of the People of Thailand, located in Yunnan in 1962. And China also supported the Khmer Rouge run a radio station from Yunnan after the Vietnamese occupation of Cambodia in December 1978. And even earlier, 75, when the Khmer Rouge took over Cambodia, China already was supporting the Khmer Rouge, one was then the official national radio station of Cambodia. And from what I can gather, that station was running right into 1993. I think Reuters was still monitoring that station at that point of time. China also supported the Burmese Communist Party to set up a radio station, a Voice of Burma, in Yodan also, from 1960s to 1989. And, for the record, China provided logistical support, the technical support to North Vietnam right through the 1950s to run its own national radio services, and through Vietnam to Laos also. So basically, China had a very long history of supporting allied communist parties to set up and run clandestine radio stations, especially during the Cultural Revolution, as Prof. Wang has pointed out. So, supporting the Communist Party of Malaya to set up this radio station, the Voice of the Malayan Revolution in 69, was part of this wider propaganda strategy. And shutting it down, as Prof. Wang has just pointed out in his remarks just now, was a consequence of a major shift in Chinese foreign policy. Yeah. However, I would contend that the closure of the Voice, as we now know, the closure of the Voice of the Malayan Revolution did not mean cessation of Chinese communist support for the soil regional communist parties. And as Dr. Pong has informed us, China offered to ship the heavy equipment of that Unam station through southern Thailand, except that through logistically not feasible. And so, as Dr. Ong has pointed out, the alternative was a mobile transmitter provided by China at the gate there. And as Dr. Ong also points out, the limitations of the new Voice of Malayan democracy faced with this new mobile station, as we say, to hide it from the ties and all that, limited its outreach here. But at both Prof. Wang and Dr. point out, the transcripts, the translation we had in this book of a critical record of how the party struggled to explain and rationalize its continued armed struggle to various audiences and justify such these negotiations. So that much we are clear from what we have heard from Dr. Ong and Prof. Wang. I would now like to suggest that these translations of the Voice of the Malayan Revolution are not only a record of the Communist Party of Malaya's attempt to define and justify its role in a rapidly changing world that was increasingly disconnected from that world. But it's also an interesting case study of failure in conducting a psychological warfare operation as part of a military strategy and operation to convey very select information to influence the emotions, the attitudes, the beliefs of its target audiences in conflict zone, meaning here basically the enemy troops here. Now here, trading on ground, which our moderator, Prof. Kumar, really is expert, having written a big book many years ago on British psyops in a counter-insurgency campaign against the Malayan Communist Party from 1948 to 1958. Yeah. And so, in the context of ballots, when I read these translations of the voice of the Malayan democracy, I asked, who is the target audience of these podcasts? Were they for the remnants of the pockets of the CPM members and fighters taking out a living in the jungle hideouts of southern Thailand? Or was it to assure them that the party is still alive and well at 55 years? And if you look at the commentaries about the mass arrest and Marxist conspirators, as Wei Chong has labeled one set the transcript, who were they aim for? Were they aim for a Singapore audience of fraternal communist parties to demonstrate the CPM's continued upholding of the struggle for freedom? Then my next question I asked was, what is the language of these broadcasts? As Dr. Ong points out here, and I quote, the claims made by the voice of the Malayan democracy in the sparkle news reports were exaggerated, particularly the casualty figures inflicted on violent security forces control. So tell me, this heroic language is reminiscent of revolutionary and ideological propaganda, and leads me to wonder whether the VND listeners found them credible and actually believed in them, or if the intention of this messaging, as in classical style, is to undermine the unity, the moral of the enemy, which in this case would be the Malayan security forces. Did the Malayan security forces actually believe in these revolutionary ideological logic of the Communist Party? So I would suggest here that perhaps our moderator Umar would like to comment on the success or failure of the voice of the Malayan democracy as an exercise in psychological warfare compared to what he was studying in British psyops in the 1940s to 50s years against the Communist Party. Yeah. I however like to go on now to suggest that these conceptual political issues of conducting psyops in support of counterinsurgents, of insurgency operations, or countering insurgent operations are common through all conflict zones where there are radio stations in the contact zone. I'd like to say that even we in Singapore confronted these problems when we ran this Thai radio station on the Thai-Cambodian border in support of the coalition government of Democratic Cambodia, which Mr. Lee Kuan Yew has reviewed in his memoirs. So, that clandestine radio station, I suggest, faced exactly the same political and conceptual problems that the VMD and the VMR are faced. Who were the target audiences? The Vietnamese troops occupying Cambodia to undermine them morale and will to fight in Cambodia? Or was it the Khmers themselves in occupied Cambodia, their homeland, and in the border refugee camps on the Thai-Cambodian border? What was to be the content of these broadcasts? Should they be battlefield rules and the style which Chong says it will be BM how and BM did, but our glorious victories by our heroic forces. So, such a style of propaganda and ideological propaganda, revolution and ideological propaganda was familiar to all the first tragedies having of the Third in China War, and even the second, but that's the first, because as that been confirmed by Prof. Wang, I think it goes back to how the Chinese Communist Party and the Kuomintang were using propaganda in the struggles from the 1920s. So that logic of how to deploy propaganda in warfare starts with the Kuomintang and the Communist Party of China in 1920. And that legacy carries all the way down to the VMD. So I go with the question, would a fight propaganda style of being more open and honest be more effective? Prof. Umar may want to reflect now on this 25-year-old study, I think it is, of how the British formulated their counterinsurgency strategy of winning hearts and minds. I think it was Templar that formulated that phrase, and he never quite liked it, isn't it? He didn't invent it. He popularized it. Yeah, he popularized it. I think somewhere Templar said it's better you grab them by the balls and their minds will follow.
That was someone from North Israel. They did not get them here. Get them.
Yeah, that was it.
That Templar was the answer lies not in throwing more troops into the jungle, but winning the hearts and minds of the Israelis. Yeah, that's what Templar said.
Yeah. So would such a strategy, of silence have been better, most convincing? Yeah. So I suggest here that these conceptual and political issues of conducting psyops in military operation may seem irrelevant in today's world. But I think Prof. Kumar says to you that it was your expertise in British counterinsurgency psyops which propelled you to the forefront in RSIS analysis of how to respond to Al-Qaeda and the appeals of Salafist Islam after 9/11. So here, the situation may change, the environment may change, but the conceptual and political issues of how to conduct psyops, whether it's against the Communist Party of Malaya or the Communist Party of Malaya against us, the problems, the issues are the same when we have to confront Al-Qaeda, Salafist Islam, and I would suggest today our colleagues who are looking to counter to what you all call drums. Is it drums? Disinformation, rumors and truths, extortions, rumors, and what's S for what? Sir, it's RSIS for your shop.
Yeah. Sense.
It's
been quite some less things he knows like if that.
So the problems here are still with us today. Yeah. And on that note, let me conclude, have you take out a bit more of my time. Yeah.
Thank you. Anybody else? Well, I think we have covered a very rich free deal of ground, which is actually very rich. Let me just approach the issues discussed the following way. Maybe the first question I always like to tell my class, the master's class in RSIS, what's the $64,000 question to be asked for after we hear various perspectives? It seems to me that in this particular case, first question we could potentially ask ourselves, because when we talk about is the value of knowing about VMD in today's context, or even in its own context. First question we like to ask is, maybe I ask Wei Zhong or Dr. Ong, how effective in your own assessment was VMD in achieving its aims of political agitation? Was it effective based on the research? Was it effective at all? And just address the course comment about my own research in the first emergency was actually 1958 to 1960. You know, before was Malayan Revolution and was Malayan democracy, in the 1950s, there was a communist CTM clandestine newspaper called Freedom News. Freedom News ran between 1948 and 1957, right? And essentially, you at that time, if you were caught in the open with Freedom News, you will be arrested. So it was the means by which the MCP kept in touch and built in the morale of the activists and the guerrillas in the jungle.
So after you do it and 放條壁過嚟，and you can see subtitles and plan as well, right?
We want the plan, a Pongtok pick. That's right.
So I would suggest that at least in the 1950s, based on my own assessment, Freedom News was perhaps moderately successful. Why do I say this? Because I remember because I did work on the Freedom News project, which eventually was published. Some of the themes in Freedom News, which were targeted at the CPM guerrillas, insurgents, was that don't give up. All right. Although you are having a pastime in the jungle right now, help is coming. Because if you look at what was happening in Indochina, by mid-1950s, Dien Bien Phu had happened. The Viet Minh had triumphed against the French. And so the thing which actually Freedom News was telling the readers was, the Viet Minh are going to come and help us. So keep going. Oh, do not give up. So it was credible. Because the communist morale did not collapse in 1955. It only collapsed much later after Tugu Abdul Rahman launched the Operation Greenland, which was a Merdeka amnesty, which gave really generous surrender terms that also to really contrast the British, relatively successful British approach in the 1950s, right? With, like you mentioned, it's called about the BMD and BMR. I would say that in order to analyze the British psychological warfare campaign in the 1950s, which was by all, analysis, a lot of scholars would say pretty successful. There were three things you have to keep in mind in order for your propaganda campaign, psychological operation to be successful. Content, credibility, and context. So to give an example, in terms of content of the British psychological warfare effort against the CPM in Malaya in the 1950s, right? 1949, the amnesty of the British Union amnesty, they didn't promise too much, right? For example, they will say things, for example, like if you come out and surrender, you'll be well treated. But the communists don't like the word surrender. So later, the beefless, they will say, come out and self-renew, So it doesn't have such a negative connotation. So tweaking the content, the words you use was an important factor. Second thing was credibility, which goes back to VFD, because like I was mentioned in the book, right, they VMD exaggerated the success against the Malaysian security forces, which everybody can see is not the case. So that affects credibility. So with the British, in the 1950s, going back to the 1950s, where they said that if you come out, you will not be prosecuted, that was not very believable. Because ex-communists were prosecuted. If they were captured, they were prosecuted. But if you say, if you come out, you'll be fairly treated, that was more credible, because many of these guys who surrendered, not captured guerrillas, or the surrendered guerrillas, they were indeed fairly treated, and the prosecution was delayed for a very long time, to such a point that eventually the charges were dropped. So when the communists remaining in the jungles saw pictures, leaflets of ex-colleagues who had surrendered, self-reviewed, right, looking very healthy, very happy, it was effective. Right? It was effective. So credibility, very important. You believed. So question for you, 1950, like to the 1980, was BMD believable to the audience? And importantly, finally, right, content, credibility, and context, for the reasons why the British, by the way, they had a lot of failures as well in the 1950s. In the 1949 amnesty, they failed, right? Because why in 1949, the communists were winning, right? Communists were clearly winning. Nobody was going to think that the British were winning. But by 1957, when Tunku launched his Merdeka amnesty, they were on the ropes. So the strategic context also matters. So if you apply, see earlier up, right? Credibility context to the case of VMD in the 1980s, what picture would you see? That's the author.
Yeah. Okay. So, thank you for this question, which was also at the foremost of my mind, and I tried to answer. But as Mr. Kwa correctly observed, who amongst the audience here actually tuned in to the VMD? How many are there? If you're around, I'll be happy to sort of do a survey with you guys. So short of that, I think you have to look at the evidence before you, and I think there are certain sort of metrics that you can use, like for example, the strength of the CPM as a movement, right? You see them actually bringing, and it's very, very, I would say, obvious in the broadcast as in terms of the combat news report. So if you sort of contrast this with the VMR, they were actually highlighting certain success in terms of combat operations. So as you know, in the 1970s, they actually managed to sabotage the National Memorial as well as assassinated the Inspector General of the Police. I think it was in 1974, if I'm not mistaken. So these were very clear successes. And look at the operations which they mounted and the counterinsurgency operations mounted by both the Malaysian and the Thais. It was clear that the CPM was a threat to the national security of Malaysia and by certain extent to Singapore. But when you contrast this from 81 to 89, you see a remarkable lack of evidence to suggest that the CPM as a movement was even sort of the same level as the 1970s. So you see really a tailing off of like going back to what you said, credibility, right? Of actually credible news which they can put out to convince the listeners that, oh, you know what, the armed revolution, it's going strong. So going back to the modus operandi of Maoist propaganda about how you must sort of translate these into action is simply not that, but translating these into action and using propaganda to galvanize the audience, which is also very familiar today. Even today, we see this in practice, it's just that methods are very different. It's all social media. But in fact, in those days, it was something which Maoist propaganda sort of enforces a lot. And how do you sort of grid this to the masses? Again, if you sort of look at the VMB and the VMR propaganda, it's about this idea of bringing the revolution to the masses, right? So you see really a disconnect over here from what was coming out from the VMD as its patient in terms of propaganda, as well as its sort of connectivity with the masses. Is simply not there. The evidence doesn't really suggest, because we look at the evidence before you don't really see the CPM growing as a movement. But what you find is they were dwindling, and then they had to split, right? So I think the evidence before us, even though I did really had a chance to sort of do a survey to interview the listeners, of the VND, I think the evidence before us suggests that the CPM as an armed revolution, if you look at 81 to 89, they were really, really dwindling as an armed revolution movement. So the message is not really sticking with the masses, and what they're trying to do is to, as much as possible, stem the decline. Right, so I think the big question is, the evidence before you is that armed revolution is not going to work, but why do you still keep with the messaging? So if you look at some of the broadcasts which they could, a lot of it was actually written by Afilasi. You see the messaging is pretty much the same, where they try to give a narrative of this is very much an anti-imperialist struggle. They're still using the same old revolutionary language, where it's clear that it does not really work, right? Because if you look around you, yes, there might be grievances, but there are other political avenues were established in Malaysia and Singapore where you can create change. So, you think about, do you have to sort of go into the jungle to live that life? It's a hard life. How can you convince someone to live that life of a Gambu gorilla where you can have avenues for political shape? So if you look at the evidence, short answer is yes, I do not see the message sort of being able to connect with the masses that the CPM or the VMD they were trying to influence.
Could I here turn to our colleague, is the CC Chin. He has conducted an extensive interview with Jinping before he passed away. I think 12 hours, 30 hours, 6 years, 16 hours, and has just published the Chinese version of that, the transcript of that. Did Jinping say anything about the BMD in his interviews with you that will help throw some light on what Jinping thought of the BMD? We know what Jinping thought about the VMR in his memoirs. He wrote, he aided the other authors.
Well, actually, the interview and dialogue with Jinping took a period of 6 years, off and on. And we had a little touch on the VMR or VFD, but I can give some insight. What result, as Professor Kumar was mentioned above, what result was VMD would have. Basically, from 1985 onward, there are already quite a number of defections from the regiment. Regiment 8, Regiment 12. Regiment 12 have 3 divisions: 1st Division, 2nd Division, and 3rd Division. The regiment, 8th Regiment, and the 2nd District of the 12th Regiment have defected and become the revolutionary faction and the Marxist-Leninist factions. But even then, the cause of the defection is because of the internal purge. So this internal purge was taken seriously. It was begin with only 22 them was suspected as the government agent, and 20 of them was executed. Only 2 of them survived as considered to be reformed. Then the central accused, the Regiment 8 and the 2nd District of the 12th Regiment. He say at least more than 50% of them are infiltrated or converted by CID and cannot be trusted, so have to be arrested and then interrogated. So with that order, so the leader of the Regiment 8 and the 2nd District was considered, because all these people was then brought on by them from the young. At the age maybe 10, 12, and how could then be converted by the CID, the special branch? So then the central does care. Sent a Jim Dark and immediately arrested 10 of them and then executed 5. And the other 5 is kept so-called underground cave. So they have to think about that. Because in between this period, about 3 months, the Central have sending telegram asked to escape these people and giving a list of names. Then they examining all this guy that was considered very loyal, warrior, how could they be spy or enemy? So then the way they look at it, if they carry out that, the regiment will be destroyed. Now, if they don't, they themselves maybe will be executed. So finally, with that so-called working brigade come down and kill the 5, so they immediately think of a way. Effected in the middle of the night. They have a special name for it called Asa Shinto, Sakai action. That have a story about it, because during the Japanese time, the Sakai was very kind to them and fed them with the kapiaka and all those, to release them from the hunger. So they were very friendly, and the Sakai liked them as well. That one night, one of the commander was looking at the Sakai and look at his very shining skin, good leg, and that you say, oh, you have such a nice leg. It will be good after steam and be eaten. So the Sakai take it seriously. So in this case, what they do, in the same night, in the middle of the night, the whole team of the Sakai disappeared. So they follow suit, follow the Sakai. So in the middle of the night, they completely disappeared from the camp. So they call this Sakai action. So after that, they left that. They sent the telegram to the central, say, we have to leave because otherwise we'll be all killed and so on. And then they argue about this internal purge principle. Then finally, about 3 years they cannot unsolve. So they formed Marxist and Leninist group. The revolutionary group, once they effected, they immediately announced the revolutionary factions established. So then in between this time, they take 8 years to communicate with Jinping in Beijing, but get no response. So finally, they joined together and formed Malaysian Communist Party. The reason is, you say, Malayan is so old, things have changed. Malaysia is an established country now. So it's an established political system. Singapore is an independent country. And therefore, still using it's outdated. And therefore, they say we have to form Malaysian Communist Party. So that's how the new party was formed. And then they go to China and contacted the External Liaison Office of CCP, and then got in touch with Jinping. So they met together and they present the whole cases. And Jinping imitated himself as a follower of Jinping, listen to their story, and then come back to tell them, well, let the history decide what's your right or wrong. So this representative thing, what do you mean history? How long? 10 years, 20 years, 100 years? So they come back, they start to form NCP, Malaysian Communist Party. So that's how it happened. So the situation is that starting from 1985, a lot of these warriors and the Communist Party member have considered there's no hope for this revolution. Why? You look at it, Malaysia economic takeoff, Singapore well off. So where's the foundation for revolutionary? So no way. And therefore, some of them completely disappointed and then run. So quite a number ran away, but some member was caught and then executed. So that is how is it? So VMD have given all the jargon which is outdated. And therefore, all this propaganda had no effect at all. And then there were no socialist, partisan socialist newspaper, no more. So there's no black and white for people to see. Now, the radio was so weak, you cannot get it in Singapore unless you're a very strong receiver. So generally, even Kuala Lumpur cannot hear. And therefore, this propaganda have no effect at all. And even those who listen to it might think. Now, I asked Chan Sing-wei, okay, the political secretary to Chancellor Lee Kuan Yew before. He was a party member. He was part of the member who was sent back from China to start the VDM. These four of them was trained in Shenyang Wireless College. So they sat back 1 year ahead. By 1980, June 1980, Deng Xiaoping and told Jinping to stop the VMR. So then they immediately sent this four guys come back to Thailand to start the BMD. So Deng Xiaoping was doing 1 year the whole operation. So until 1981, June 1981, the last day was the 30th. And Jinping asked for 3 more minutes for the message. Was denied. So Jinping was very angry. Even 3 minutes was not given. So that, okay, that's it, close. So that's VMD was started 1 year ahead for preparation. So when the day closed in Hunan, the second day, 1st July 1981, started VMD in Thailand. Now, this 4 members, except Chan Sing-wei passed away, the others still survive. One of them is a girl who do all the transcription and so on. Now it's helping me. He do all the transcription on my recording. She happened to be the sister of Xin Wangfu, the creative of Xin Wangfu, the creative technology's boss. She came back. He's my older sister. So this is actually was a cheaper. Here's a chance to operate a dinner show. That's about. So this is how it. So VMD since 1985 onward, there's no effect at all. Psychologically fake.
Thank you. So as you can see, the context matters in the 1970s BMR. If I understand what Sri Chong is saying, the context was different because you could argue that, in fact, it was mentioned in the book as well that during the 70s at the heyday of VMR, you could argue that communism was on the advance globally. The Cold War was raging, so that's different. But by the 1980s, especially after 1985, as Sir Jin mentioned, with the defections, VMD had a different context. There's a different context as well. Drop one less. So call to add something into this hosted as class. Yeah.
I would make the point that
Wait, is there any other mic for Mr. Desker?
thanks. I would make the point that when the split occurred, and you had the Marxist, Leninists, and the revolutionary factions, which actually united and formed the Malaysian Communist Party. What was interesting about that was that unlike the CPM, they recognized the state of Malaysia separate from the state of Singapore, and their focus was only on Malaysia. And I believe that they also had their own portable transmitters for the voice of Malaysian democracy, or the voice of Malaysian revolution, correctly. Do you have any of the transcripts of their broadcasts?
Mr. Deska, I think it's definitely a project to consider. Yeah. Yeah, but
The second observation
we definitely work towards that, Mr. Deska. We'll update you as soon as possible.
The second observation I would make is I to listen to the VMR podcasts from Onan in the early 70s. And those podcasts were actually much clearer, much better than anything which you would hear from SBC or from the Malaysian radio. And you could get the broadcast would clearly, whether you were in Bali or in Manila attending meetings.
So head of the VFR at Ola actually was a spare station for China radio. So the broadcast over. And that one is very strong, very strong. You're attack strong than anyone.
Very, very clear.
Yeah. And secondly, about perhaps Malaysian Communist Party and CPM. So, but Malaysian Communist Party, so short form as MCP.
Yeah.
So to confuse the SMP, so the Communist Party of Malaya is of CPM. So to the same is true too. Both principle still consider Malaya, Peninsula Malaya, and Singapore as one piece, no different. For CPM, they did not concentrate, or because now we concentrate on Malaysia at all. It's still considered a Singapore case. So their underground operation was in Singapore too. The famous dancer, Oli Jian, the late dancer, and his husband was treated to the second district of 12th division upper regiment. It's stylistic. So he come back, was arrested. So that was work. And the lady who we charge of this, I forgot, so Feng Jie, lady finished.
Oh, yes, but
Question at the back is really Joe. Hi, sorry, just to ask. Has there been any research? Two questions. One is that has there been requests, Mr. Jinnat? So that's the question. Has there been any reception studies done on people who actually tuned in and listened to that? What's theoretically or one question is actually on reception studies. The people who have actually listened to them or tuned in, has there been studies done on the actual impact of listeners, people tuned in? Second, do there exist recordings of all the broadcasts? And have people studied the way it was broadcasted? Because reading transcript is one thing, but hearing it, the actual tone and the voice in the way it was asked and presented is another thing. So do actual sound recordings exist of this broadcast? And actually have people studied the way it was spoken and delivered? So it's the importance of transmission is something that will be interesting.
thanks. You have any?
Yeah, it's okay. I don't need a mic. So I think I've sort of mentioned earlier that sort of interviewing listeners who've actually tuned in to it, the VMD would be something that we would like to do. But it's just that, given that the period, the time that you had to sort of were given to pick up this book, it is not something which considered, because the book was intended as a publication of the transcripts. And may I add that what you see over here in terms of the book before you is just a selection. So I believe I went through about 4,000 over pages, and what you have is really sort of what I think were the important transcripts that should be in this volume. But obviously, if you buy the book, you would have access to all the 4,000 different transcripts which will be made available. So that's all caveat, right? Even as mentioned.
Just need a sales pitch, right?
Well, it's a sales pitch. It's for the school because, as you know, this it's
It's really
yeah. So as I mentioned earlier, it is something that given the time as well as the sort of ability that you find those listeners will be something that that we actually intended to do, but we thought that it wasn't really practicable. Given the timeline that we have to dock the book. And yes, I think the way in which you put out a message over video, I think it matters, especially to a generation that's like mostly on social media. The tone, the language, the way in which you articulated. So sort of read the transcripts, you realize that the officers making the transcripts, sometimes they will say things like, oh, you know what, the accent is very strong, difficulty making out the accent. So I think it's like, not everyone is speaking with like, a posh Beijing accent that can work for CCTV. But I think like, yes, this is when we see certain deviations, right? I would say between the BMR as well as the DND in terms of like the expertise as well. So I think in the case of the VMD, they really had to make do with the resources. So like, I think CG mentioned that they 4 people, right? Whereas the VMR was a much larger operation compared to the VAT. So I think the resources also had an impact on which they could run the station. So even if you look at a variety of broadcasts, you find that the quality of what went into programs, it was weaker compared to the VMR. Yeah, but I really, the presentation, the orator measures. I mean, like, so some of the podcasts you can sort of tune in and listen for hours, right? Because the person doing it is so good. Whereas if I listen to my own voice, I will switch off after 5 minutes. Yeah.
Any other comments or questions from the floor?
Remember the sales pitch of the Ong just made, where he subtly slipped it into his answer? Well, one of the questions I would like to ask, it actually relates to what Mr. Koh was saying about the rule of, white propaganda. Maybe you made a comment about that. Well, that is a phrase that I haven't heard in a very long time because yours?
Because nowadays we're just in the grey zone.
Okay, well, yes. But okay, for context, for those sort of
Black and white.
black, white, and grey, so I better tell them what I mean for at least in World War II, which I believe the category still persisted into the 1950s. In that term was used definitely in the 1950s by the British in Malaya. White propaganda referred to propaganda or messaging where the source of it was clear, who was speaking, and the information was truthful, right? So the source is clear, information is truthful, so it's white propaganda in 1950s. They used to give an example. BBC is a very good example of white propaganda because it's truthful, who is talking. Black propaganda, which was discussed by the psychological warfare people in the UK in the 1940s and especially 1950s. And they used that to describe the way the Nazis put out the propaganda, like Goebbels and the big lie. Essentially, you lie. I mean, the information is not true. It's fake news in today's terms. And sometimes you don't even know the person saying, giving the message might be a false name. So it's black, right? It is unknown. Grey propaganda also existed in that particular historical context. Grey was sometimes the source is not clear. The messaging might be true, but the source is not clear. Not really know who this person is. So they call it grey, right? So it's going to ask a very interesting question about, is white propaganda more effective? No, or especially in today's terms, right? They go about fake news, where disinformation. I mean, one of the things which we, of course, would be interested in, I'm sure this audience will be interested in, is what is the modern day relevance of a study like VMT? Is it just a historical curiosity, or is there something we could sort of draw out from the VMD example for today's context, practitioners or analysts trying to make sense of disinformation and trying to counter it? What do you think? I mean, which one of these is you are, also a specialist in high-grade warfare. I mean, studying, like, not that you're ages in every warfare, but you study high-grade warfare.
I get high-grade warfare from other people.
Maybe you want to give it a shot. What do you think?
Yeah, so I think, well, what strikes me is going back to that central question, right? Why persist? Why persist? the will to fight. I think it's very important for today's context, right? Especially when we look at what actually draws someone to take up arms and sort of, live the hard life of a jungle guerrilla. So to me, this is a very, very interesting question. Why we fight, especially when you look at how the CPM, although not as successful in the 1970s, but nonetheless, they were still able to recruit some of the local Thais. I think there's certain evidence that quite a number of local Thais, and mind you, not Chinese, but actually Thai Malays living in southern Thailand that actually joined the CPM. So I think this will have certain, I wouldn't say answers, but certain insights in the motivations of what makes some young cat give up everything and live the hard life of a jungle guerrilla. To me, I think this is something that would resonate today, right? How do you sort of, I wouldn't use the word radicalize, which is a very 21st century term, but what sort of makes someone decides to actually embark on this totally different way of life? It's a very, I would say, it's a massive divergence from you as someone who is actually living in a rather peaceful environment and having to make that very drastic switch. So I think these are certain, I would say, insights that we can have for the present day, simply why we fight. And I would say, despite the decline of the CPM as a movement, the Thai security forces weren't able to completely eradicate the CPM as a movement, right? So I think that's one of the reasons also what led to the Thai security forces also reaching out to first, I think there were parallel tracks. First, they signed the first peace agreement with the Communist Party of Malaysia and then the CPM. So I think these are very, very useful insights for the present, especially motivations to fight and what sort of drives angry young men actually men, for some strange reason, to take up arms.
Well, the issue today is still with us, isn't it? How did Al Qaeda persuade all those people to go and blow themselves up? Same.
So that for me is a very, very crucial insight, especially when you look at the CPM, which was actually, the declining movement, but yet at the same time, they could recruit some of the local Thais to join there. So I think that's very interesting for today's practitioners or, looking at a better term, counter-radicalization.
Well, today, as Kumar will tell you, you all are watching fought all those jihadist movement. They're trying to fathom what motivates a Thai to be radicalized and how do you counter-radicalize that group of people. So we are still having the same problem. But if I may put a question to Short Ones, we talk about propaganda. In the English language, propaganda is terrible, productive. But how does it translate to Chinese? Is Suen Chuan, is it? Chang? Chuan.
Transmit.
Yeah. So I think my understanding is that has an entirely different meaning, isn't it? Going back to, in fact, the old classic way of just transmitting accurate, good knowledge. Am I right, Kofang? Maybe elaborate on that.
Let me say that I had no comment on your other question because I was not there. All of you were here. At least it would have been possible for you to know who was listening or what was coming through the ad. I wasn't in Singapore or Malaysia from 1968 upwards. I was somewhere else. So I had a different perspective altogether. So my interest in the subject is primarily to see what China was doing as part of my study of China and what China was doing, why it was doing what it was doing, and to what extent it was successful or not. That would have interested me more. So I was very struck by the fact that all this time, the moment China was accepted into the United Nations, there was a major shift in how China presented itself to the world. When there's no question about it, it became another country, normal country. It's setting up a Ministry of Foreign Affairs, doing all the sort of diplomatic and all the things that other countries also did. So the question of how many layers of operational personnel that they employed doing different things at the same time is of some interest to me. And so what I observe was, I was in Australia where China was admitted into the United Nations in 1971. And that within a few months, Australia established diplomatic relations. And then I was watching, because I was interested in diplomatic relations in Malaysia, I was really surprised that Marcos was also interested in diplomatic relations. At that point, most Argentine country in Southeast Asia was interested in diplomatic relations. But also, of course, the Chinese were warning them as a normal country, as a member of the United Nations, we should normalize our relationships. So operating at that level, they were no different from any other country. But of course, no different from other countries, they also on other operational levels and doing other things. So the question is, how many levels were there, and where does this VMR or VMD fit into that structure? That I'd be really curious about. So I didn't know much about it until I read about the VMR and VMD. Where do they fit in the Chinese structure? Who was doing that? To what extent was it centrally based? To what extent was locally based in different parts of CCP, local parts of CCP? To what extent there were different factions of the CCP who had different intensity of faith? Some were more ideological, some were just simply professionally natural operators, and others had different ideological interpretations of Marxist Leninism or Maoism. So there are many layers. So I'm just curious to know who were really behind people like Wichiyuk, Egypt, and BMD or VMR operating the Hunan. Were they directly set from central control? Are not clear. Is it a central waiting for information, instructions of Beijing? I'm not sure. They will have local people making decisions on their own. Who were these people? Unnamed and so on. I don't know who they were in China. I mean, I'm not talking about MCP members. I'm talking about CCP people who are actually operating these groups. What are they telling them to do? On what basis? On whose instruction? And how to interpret the revolution to all these people outside in Southeast Asia? That is still not clear to me, but I'm curious to know the progress. So when you think about that, I was interested because all the time I was visiting China regularly when you in Singapore and Malaysia couldn't do it because it's operative of Australia as an academic. I went to China in the middle of the Cultural Revolution. I could talk to various people. I went there several times to help my students, graduate students, approach the Chinese. They were extremely awkward, very, very helpful, very cooperative, and they were sending their delegations to Australia to study Australian studies and so on. And they were regular delegations, right from the top to the bottom. I mean, all the way from, at that time, all the way from Fuji Tower was really more or less chosen to be one of the right young men to come up from the youth wing. So they were coming to China. People like all the top leaders, one after the other, visiting Australia. I'm not in that field. I just saw them. I was introduced to them. Many chances to meet them. And when I was actually invited by the Australian government to chair the Australia-China Council, I ever met even more of them. And they operated at a level which was, I would say, the same as any other country. Very friendly, extremely open. So while that was happening, I read all this with great interest. What are these guys talking about? There's nothing to link what they were talking about, addressing to the people of Malaysia and Singapore, to what these other guys are talking, say, to the Australian people. Totally unrelated. And not at all, nothing to connect the two that I can see. So this should give me an indication of how any government operates at different levels. And what I am curious to know is VMR and then VMD, at what operational level were they operating in the Chinese structure?
Ostensibly, it's party to party, ostensibly.
Ostensibly, but even party itself, it's an enormous party. I mean, as far as I know, they now have 100 million members of the Chinese Communist Party. Who is operating what? And to extent that we know that the political and economic terms in China, they decentralize a lot of things. Not everything comes in the center. The center actually decentralized a lot of decisions. Left to the party secretary of a province, party secretary of a district or the prefecture. Leave it to that. The center gives you a general, like some of Xi Jinping's statements, very general statements, but how you interpret it down in each province and so on, I don't think Xi Jinping cares, because as long as you generally follow the very vague statements that he makes in his great speeches, and so on. So, and then you realize that even from our people today, the examples of when we are dealing with China, if you're dealing with somebody in Chongqing, very different from dealing with someone in Fujian or someone in Heilongjiang or Tibet or Xinjiang. Very different. Each area, the party secretary is boss. In some way, actually, one of my colleagues described the Chinese system as a semi-federal system, because they decentralized to such an extent that every province actually almost operated on its own. And when they, for example, in economic terms, the Chinese government today encourages what they call competition within China. They want them to compete because then you get produce or work harder or get improved or techniques better. And what province does better than another, then you know this province is different. This guy gets promoted, you don't get promoted. So, and they allow them a lot of freedom to operate on their own. So that comes out. My question is, BMR and VMD, where is that coming from? Is it directly from the center, or is it operating by some other various groups? And therefore, it won't surprise me that in Thailand itself, there are different groups operating each on their own idea of what the revolution meant, and what revolution should be doing, what is right and wrong, what is sufficiently revolutionary, some is very, very, but slipping away from revolution, or eaten and interpreted differently by the different little groups around. So I just feel that this is a part that I don't quite get. I've read both volumes, but I don't know exactly where it comes from. And I don't know whether you can find out more about this.
Liting briefly.
I think, this is where sort of kind of like more detailed interviews with the cadres who are right now in, because they had the 1989 peace agreement, there were peace villages in Southern Thailand. It could be useful to actually sort of do interviews to answer some of the questions that Prof. had. Yeah, I think TCG wants.
But 1 minute, because I are talking. Happy I can share some light, because actually in CCP, there's this special external liaison department, 中联部分野. Now this department deal with all fraternal artist relationships. All decision from its external relation minister. There's minister and there's vice minister. I know one of the vice minister who fully in charge of MCP or CPM. His name is Zhang Xiangsan. Now, all decision about MCP have to refer to him. He will give the instruction. If anything that affects the entire CCP, now he will consult with the Secretary General of CCP, like Deng Xiaoping or Zhao Ziyang or whoever at that time was the CCP Secretary General. So actually it was questionable. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Jin. Well, don't know about you, but I thought a very rich discussion with the panel, with the author. So I hope you had enough information and analysis to chew on, and it's motivating you to sort of buy the book by Dr. Ong. So please, could just ask you to join me in thanking our panelists for this afternoon's discussion. Thank you very much.